Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our discussion of all these isms that are just absolutely riveting. Oh my God, it's going to be so much fun and so much interest going around right now because it's going to be like conservatism, classical liberalism, socialism, blah, 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 blah. Some of y'all are going to find this really interesting. Some of you are going to want to punch yourself in the noggin just to get me to stop talking about people's political perspectives, right? So the big thing about it, though, is like I'm going to stick to that guarantee that I told you, right? 25 minutes or under, okay? We're going to stick to that no matter what. However far we get is however far we get, okay? We're not going to sit here and cry and complain and worry about things that we did or did not cover because it's up to me. We'll figure it out. I'm not worried about it, so you shouldn't be worried about it, so let's keep pushing. Now, a big question you might be having to yourself right now is like, okay, we're going to just like go off of the notes that we started in class, right? Or we just going to build up off of that stuff? Yeah, sort of, kind of, okay? I actually spent all day yesterday completely remaking this Prezi and doing something absolutely ridiculous that I've never done before. I actually am going to be posting this to Google Classroom. I made you an entire graphic organizer of all the political isms that we're about to talk about and gave you visual stimulus with each and even gave you like defining quotes and buzzwords and like all that other really cool stuff, right? So I'm going to post that to Google Classroom. And so some of y'all might be like, well, if I have it on Google Classroom, why am I about to write it down, right? Look, they're your notes, okay? They are your notes. You can choose to or not to write down this entire first section of the flip. That is really up to you. I am not here to police you, okay? But the big thing I am going to tell you is the way we're about to go through it right now is I'm going to be going through a little bit like slower, and I'm going to be going through like a very, very watered down version of it, right? So some of you might want to write it down just so you can remember it and stuff like that, commit it to memory a little bit better. But we're going to work through each of them one at a time. We're going to go all the way through conservatism, all the way through classical liberalism, and then all the way through the socialism. And then we're going to like kind of take a magnifying glass approach to conservatism a little bit, and then also to socialism in this flip as well. Talk about some of its earliest thinkers and some things that they really, really hate, right? And things that are probably going to eventually take them down. When I talk about taking them down, I'm mainly talking about those conservatives, right? So the conservatism movement or conservatism during the 19th century is going to be really, really important, right? We've met a couple of conservatives before already, okay? So you had Edmund Burke was one of the ones we met early on. He's the English guy that talked down about the French Revolution, right? The guy that was like, oh, it's a tragedy what's happening on the continent right now. And then we also met, of course, Clemens von Metternich. And I told you that crazy story about how I literally found a hateful person in my classroom from talking about that one person, right? So going into it, though, okay, who are they, all right? Conservatives at this time period are wealthy aristocrats, royals, people that basically existed in the top two parts of the feudal, like the feudal pyramid and that feudalism diagram that we talked about all the way back over the summer, right? That's who the conservatives are at this point, okay? They're very aware that power structures are changing. They're very aware that things are going on, and they're shifting a lot of business interests appropriately, but the biggest thing that they won't let go of is they won't let go of the idea of how they think people should be ruled, right? They're still very much in favor of absolute monarchies, right? Absolute monarchies and or elitist governments, right? They're in favor of the idea of the monarch representing the nobles and representing tradition and privilege and hereditary rights and stuff like that. They also have a very extreme Hobbesian view of people, right? They believe that the poor should stay in their place, and they believe that something very, very important is private property. They think they are the ones that deserve private property because private property in the hands of everybody, according to many conservatives, is just going to lead to chaos and things like that, right? So the thing about it, though, is next part, okay? What do they feel about suffrage, all right? Now, suffrage, for those of you who don't already know, is actually the right to vote, okay? Suffrage, for example, when you talk about it next year in Mr. Wooderson's class, you'll talk about women's suffrage in the 20th century, right? In the early 1900s, women's suffrage movements. And we'll talk about that in this classroom as well. And we'll talk about how Europeans actually gave, in many countries, Europeans gave women the right to vote before the Americans ever did, right? Well, a big thing about it, though, is conservatives don't even think women should vote. They don't even think men should vote. They think no one should be allowed to vote, right? They believe that voting systems are just going to lead to revolutions and chaotic things going forward, right? They're not completely wrong, but at the same time, people deserve the right to vote, if you ask me, right? Now, constitutions, how do they feel about those? They don't like them. They think constitutions are terrible because it's going to limit their power and it's going to actually push forward Enlightenment ideas, right? Now, the economy that they believe in the most is mercantilism, right? They literally felt as though under mercantile efforts that trying to keep money hoarded inside of the country, hoarded in liquid assets like gold and silver and things like that, and actual precious metals was more along the lines of something that benefited them, right? They're in favor of high tariffs, and they're also in favor of extreme government intervention into the economy in a sense of trying to hoard that money and those funds within the borders, right? Now, what are some things that they hate, all right? This is literally like their dating profile, right? Like, for example, like, oh man, this is something I like, this is something I don't. Now, look, the thing about it though is, what are some things they hate? They hate Enlightenment ideas, they hate classical liberals, and they also don't like socialists as well, right? They don't really like anybody because they want to go back to the way that things were, okay? Now, what are things they love? Traditions and the old way, okay? Now, again, on that graphic organizer that I made that I'm going to post to Google Classroom, you can see all of these ideas expanded on even further, right? We got key people, key ideas, defining quotes, stuff like that, and even like little political cartoons as well, okay? Now, going forward, the next one's up at the bat. We have classical liberals, right? How do classical liberals feel? Who are they, right? So first of all, you've met a couple of classical liberals already. We've talked about the Marquis de Lafayette, and we've also talked about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette are very great representations of classical liberalism and the ideas of liberals going forward. Even though, ironically enough, the Marquis de Lafayette is a part of the noble class, he's still a classical liberal by choice, by trade, and by action, right? Because he believes in Enlightenment ideas and his roles in the French Revolution, and also his objection to things like the Reign of Terror and things like that really demonstrate his middle-of-the-road concepts, right? Now, going forward, though, also we know that he helped write the Declaration of the Rights of Man with Thomas Jefferson, right? So who are they? They're middle class primarily, or the bourgeois. Now, sometimes some of the nobles can be considered classical liberals, but we're not going to get into that right now. We're not going to get into the overlaps or the gray areas or any of that stuff at this point, right? Now, what is the government that they like? We know that conservatives like absolutism. What is the government that the classical liberals actually really, really enjoy, right? They like a constitutional monarchy, which is what we talked about in class, or they like a democratic republic, right? Now, a constitutional monarchy, aka a limited monarch, very much like the British government, is something that they're a fan of, because that actually is going to give the ability of a legislative branch, usually actually populated by business owners and people of the middle class, to actually limit or check the power of that monarch, right? And kind of working in a duality system of allowing the monarch to represent the ideas of the noble classes and allowing a legislative body to represent the ideas of the middle class, and then, of course, speaking for the lower class, right? And they also really like democratic republics, which are the American style system, voting on a representative to go and represent their constituents at a greater cause or course in a place like DC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Now, how do they feel about private property? This is a really, really big one, okay? They are big fans of private property, but they're big fans of private property in the sense of Adam Smith types of private property, right? They believe that you can have private property if you can afford it, because they believe that if you've worked hard and done your things and really, really kind of lucked out in a lot of ways because you invested in a business and actually were able to make a lot of money off of it, they believe that you should be allowed to have that private property if you can actually afford it and actually go and get it, right? Now, what about suffrage? How do they feel about people's rights to vote? They think that only a few select people should be allowed to vote. They do not want poor people to be able to vote. They do not want people who are uneducated to be able to vote, okay? So suffrage and the ideas of classical liberalism could even be seen in early America, because only white property-owning men could vote in the earliest parts of America, but as we know with our history, as time goes forward, everyone deserves the right to vote. And so we are going forward, we understand that that crosses boundaries of gender, property ownership, socioeconomic status and things like that. So let's make sure that we understand that classical liberalism is a little bit of a loaded term. Now, really, really quickly, speaking of that, limited suffrage, okay? When you connect the word liberal in the modern era and suffrage, liberals in the modern era would say everyone deserves the right to vote no matter what, point blank, period, anybody and everybody, because they're much more libertine with social causes, right? That's why we have to call these people that we're talking about right now classical liberals, because classical liberals today are much more like conservatives now, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Classical liberalism has now become the old way, because they actually push forward into the sense of progress, and you would actually relate more of liberal ideas today closer to the third category, socialism of the era of the 19th century. Now, conservatives of the 19th century don't really exist anymore. Who's advocating for absolutism anymore or noble privilege, right? No one. So you see what I'm talking about? That's why we have to refer to them as classical liberals, right? So constitutions, how do they feel about it? They love them, right? They absolutely love constitutions because they believe it's going to set up people's rights and their ideas and reinforce those Enlightenment ideals going forward, okay? Now, what about the economy? How do they feel about that? They believe in free markets, right? I know Avery over there, right? Avery Young, right? Who got the baby and is very excited to bring a king cake next class, or whatever class you want to, Avery. You go for it, kid. It's really up to you. They really, really, really love the idea of the free market economy, right? Adam Smith is a classical liberal. Like the ideas of the hidden hand of competition, right, Olivia? Okay, all that fun stuff is all elements of a classical liberal like mindset during this time period. What are things they hate? They don't like socialists, they don't like overactive governments, and they also do not like the idea of hereditary rights. Or okay, things that they love though, they love nationalism, free market capitalism, laissez-faire economics because they want the government to stay out of the regulation of their businesses, and they love the ideas of competition, right? They love the ideas that Adam Smith has put out there, that John Locke has put out there, born with rights, not hereditary rights, right? Natural rights versus traditionally inherited rights. So those are your classical liberals. But last but not least, who are your socialists, right? We've talked a little bit about one of these guys already, Karl Marx, but he's much later. So as you can see right here, this is a photograph. He actually is not going to really come around and become very popular or prominent until the 1840s, right? But the first socialist that we'll talk about in this flip as well, that's Count Henri de Saint-Simon, right? But socialists, though, who are they, okay? Socialists at the time are the lower ends of the classes, right? The working class, the poor, the very, very low end of that socio-economic triangle that we looked at during the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, what government do they like? They like the idea of a direct republic, right? The general will, or a very active government. In the sense of, they believe that the state has the responsibility, or that the government has the responsibility to control all aspects of people's lives, in a sense, to avoid anyone from taking advantage of each other, right? So the interesting thing about it is they're almost kind of like circling back around on the political spectrum, because they believe that most people are good, but that you have to have a government to protect those good people from people that are not, right? How do they feel about private property, though? Okay, we've got this like old standard. This is their dating profile. How do they feel about private property? They hate it because they feel like it's going to fracture the sense of community, and it's going to lead to competition between people. They don't like that idea, okay? Now, how do they feel about suffrage? They believe that suffrage should be universal. They feel that all people should be able to vote, sorta. Even socialists during this time did not advocate for the voting rights of women, which is hot garbage. All right, so like now, but we'll get into that stuff a little bit later on. But they believed that all free like men should be allowed to vote universally, right? Which is still at the time considered a very, very big deal. Constitutions, how do they feel about those? They like them. They don't love them, but they do like them. The reason why they like them a lot is due to the fact that they do think it's important to set up standard rights and set up standard laws and set up standard things that are inalienable and can't be taken away from somebody, but they believe without a very extreme government to enforce those rights that there's no point, right? And what kind of economy do they like? They liked planned economics, right? Planned economics as in, remember the reign of terror, the bread of equality, right? A planned economy is like that, right? Setting prices on certain items that are never going to change or go over anything that a poor person could not afford, right? So that's a great example. A planned economy is set prices, redistributed wealth to make sure that everybody has equal access to everything, okay? So, going forward, what are some things that they hate? They hate individualism, they hate free markets, they hate capitalism, and they hate anything anti-worker, right? They also hate classical liberals and conservatives, right? Now, ironically enough, if a classical liberal were to play with either of these two groups, they'd sooner play with the socialists than they would the conservatives. Keep that in the back of your mind. Put a little star note over there somewhere, a little sticky note, slap that in there and be like, if the conservatives had to pick a side, they'd probably pick the socialists, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later on and how that's going to happen, okay? Now, things that they love direct government intervention, and they love popular uprisings, right? They love when the government comes in, sets standards, redistributes wealth, breaks up huge corporations, does any of that stuff. And they also love when a bunch of people get really, really angry and they overthrow a government if they need to, okay? So that's a big element of socialism. These are your three big groups that we're dealing with right now. Now we're going to take a minute to kind of zoom in on some of these groups and talk a little bit more about specific things that they are afraid of, things that they do like, things that they don't like, things like that. Some of you are going to understand why I have Superman and Kryptonite over here in about 2 seconds, because we got to talk about conservative kryptonite, okay? Now look, the big thing about it that you need to understand is that conservatives are truly afraid of two very, very interesting little concepts, right? And it's called self-determination and constitutions. Now, really, really quickly, why would they be so afraid of these two things? Well, one, the Constitution one, I don't need to explain that, right? Why would a conservative be afraid of it like an actual, Constitution, because it's giving people basic rights that can be enforced by a law-abiding body, that can actually be carried out by a legislative body. They don't like that. They want to be able to just say absolutely, oh, well, we're here to protect you from yourselves because you're all scumbags. They don't like constitutions for that reason. But the one that you don't know about yet is self-determination. Constitutions and self-determination go together to create conservative kryptonite, i.e. the one thing that can destroy them, right? Superman, as you know, is weak to only one element. I hope you know this anyway. Is only like weak to one thing, and that's this junk from his home planet called kryptonite, right? And so the thing about it is, if these two things combine together, self-determination and constitutions, it will destroy the Superman that is conservatives that have ruled over Europe for so long and seem invincible, right? The concept of self-determination is what it is a cultural group of people that determines its own statehood or collectivization, right? Now let's talk about what that means in the grand scheme. Conservatives, listen to me closely, okay? Listen to me very closely. Conservatives hate this concept because most conservative absolute monarchies and most monarchies are ruling over a vast multicultural empire, right? Let's use Austria as a good example. This is Austria, the Austrian Habsburg monarchy during the 19th century, okay? As you can see, everything in green are people that speak German, which is what Austrians speak. And if this is the Austrian Empire, shouldn't everyone speak German? Well, that's just the thing. They controlled all these other different people. Poles, Czechs, like Hungarians, Bosnians, Serbians, Croatians, all these other different people that spoke different languages, had different cultures, and all these other things were under the reign of the Austrians. That right there, that is what they're afraid of, because with self-determination, the Hungarians can create their own country. The Serbians can create their own country and break away from the Austrian Empire, making the Austrians weaker and smaller, right? So of course this would scare a conservative, right? The idea that these people are being like, well, I don't even speak your same language. Why am I in your country? Why am I under your rulership? Is it because I don't have a really big military and you're pointing a gun at me? Yes, that's exactly what it is. So conservatives hate the idea of self-determination, and you can see this in the Russian and the Ottoman example. Clemens von Metternich came along and united two conventional enemies, right? Russia and the Ottomans did not like each other at all during the 19th century whatsoever. But Clemens von Metternich was able to show up and get them to agree to stop fighting one another so that they could focus on not losing groups inside their empires, right? So it's really impressive when you think about the idea that they're like, hey, you know how you love to oppress people in your empires, Ottomans and Russians? That's something y'all have in common. So put your guns down, don't point them at each other. Instead, point them at the people that speak different languages in your empires, right? So the interesting thing about this is that conservatives are truly, truly afraid of this concept of self-determination and constitutions, right? Because look at this map. Look at how few colors there are on it. But if you look at a modern map of Europe, it's covered in numerous different kingdoms and numerous different cultural places that speak a one unified language set, right? For example, in the Austrian Empire over here, and the Russians, they actually split what is now the modern day Ukraine, right? So the big thing about it is the Ukraine today exists because it's self-determined, right? It literally was like, we are Ukrainian, we speak Ukrainian, we do what we want, we're a country, right? So looking at this as well, is there really peace in this entire thing, right? Is there really, really peace in this age of Metternich, right? During this age of Metternich, where the Russians and the Ottomans are no longer fighting each other and just destroying people inside their own continent, or excuse me, inside of their own empire, is there really peace? Or is this like Elmo with a knife, right? Well, it's much more like Elmo with a knife. So the thing about it in the long run is all these conservatives are fighting what they actually referred to at the time as this dual revolution, right? And what the dual revolution is the economic and political changes, which is like Napoleon's toothpaste, okay? It's the economic and political changes that the French Revolution embodied, right? The ideas that the revolution embodied and attempted with its planned economies and its overthrowing of a king and its redistributing property and its giving more things to poor people and stuff like that. Those ideas, right, that fused and reinforced the ideas of socialism and liberalism in action is what they're afraid of, right? They're fighting economic and political changes that classical liberals and socialists are advocating for, right? So the big thing about it is when we're looking at this, Britain is the one little weird group that doesn't really apply to this whole thing, right? Why do they not care about the issues going on the continent? Why are they not really fighting this dual revolution thing? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Britain at this time period is much more classically liberal than anything else, and they were also the very first ones to start it. And just like Stella said in class, they're far away, they're making all their own money, they're industrial revolutionizing, they're doing their own thing. They are bridging the gap between the conservatives and the classical liberals, so you're not going to see the same chaos break out in Britain like it does everywhere else. And Britain will also quickly liberally reform. Are they going to have some issues? Yes. The massacre at Peterloo is going to be a big issue that they're going to have to deal with that's going to demonstrate all this revolutionary fervor, but they just don't have to deal with it extremely like the continental conservatives do, right? Now, with that, though, there was an alliance within the alliances, or a lunch group within the lunch groups. Y'all have lunch groups, right? You know how there are kids in your lunch group that are closer friends than they are with other people in the lunch group? That's what the Holy Alliance is, right? The Holy Alliance is kind of like the three super conservative powers that are on the continent, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, are working together to prevent self-determination and constitutions, fighting the dual revolution, while Britain's kind of over on its own island being like da-da-da-da-da-da, and just kind of the moving quadruple alliance member, right? The thing about it, though, is with the Holy Alliance, they do have a goal, and their goal together, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, is to try and do something very important. Destroy any attempt to bring up an actual constitutional system. And does this happen from time to time throughout European history? Of course it does, right? And Spain and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies are the best examples, right? Spain actually did have at one point an attempt to overthrow its government, its conservative government, and actually try to put in a constitutional government instead. What is going to happen? Russia, Prussia, and Austria are going to unite together, send an army over there, and destroy this uprising, right? Same kind of thing. Two Sicilies, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, had a monarchy that they tried to overthrow and establish an actual constitutional government. Prussia, Russia, and Austria are going to unite together, send their militaries over there, and crush it, right? So one big thing you got to notice right here is that Spain tried to do it by itself. And then the other three countries will unite together, go and destroy them. Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which is in southern Italy, tried to do it by themselves. They go over, they destroy that attempt, right? Now, it's going to be really different in 1848 when all these countries try to do it all at once, but just keep that in the back of your mind, right? And it actually got so bad at one point that even Clemens von Metternich was passing these things called the Carlsbad Decrees, which was actually an attempt to try and root out subversive ideas. They actually took spies and put them in universities, right? Because universities at the time were considered hubs of growing classical liberal ideas. And these spies would go to lectures, go on campus, listen to conversations and stuff like that, and try to stop revolutions before they even started, right? So just so you can see, the conservatives, the Holy Alliance, is very active in trying to fight off and stave off any attempted revolutions that could pop up in the continent during the 19th century, right? Now, it's all going to fail miserably, mostly due to the fact that there is a virus amongst them, right? A virus, much like many other viruses and things like that, is something you can't quite stop, okay? The virus of the conservatives is this idea of nationalism, right? This is going to be the thing that helps destroy them, because the idea that each people has its own genius and its own unity, its common language and history, is going to lead to uprisings, revolts, and unification of peoples, whether they like it or not, right? Because the big thing about nationalism is it's going to lead to the ideas that people united together can actually go against the government and go forward, right? Because many of these revolutions are actually going to happen because of national identity and unification. Now, coming from the growing idea of self-determination, this idea that I should be my own country because of my language and my groups and my hereditary lineage in the sense of my culture, is the thing that's uniting all these people together. Now, these ideas are beginning to grow. Nationalism doesn't really take full effect. Jot this down really quick, make a little note of it. Nationalism doesn't take massive full effect until after 1848, until after these really big revolutions that break out all over the place, okay? But nationalism is going to be creeping up on them, right? It's this idea of change, of difference, of unity, of individual, ideas of my personal self growing, rather than listening to the ideas of a large, oppressive, empirical government, right? So that right there is where we're going to cut it. That was a lot of stuff that we just talked about right now. We just talked about 4 different isms that popped up, right? Conservatism, classical liberalism, socialism, and nationalism, right? So the big thing about it, though, is make sure you get all this stuff down. We're going to cut it right there, and we're going to look at a bunch of pretty stuff next class, and we're going to talk about socialism a little bit as well, right? I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.